Welcome to A Case for America. I am Austin Hepworth, here along with Michael Hepworth, and today we are excited to talk about the 10th Amendment. On A Case for America, we take the position that America is an amazing land and country, something that we love and something that we believe was founded on some important principles. And to the extent we follow these principles that appropriately strike the balance for liberty, we will be prosperous and able to enjoy life to the fullest that we can, is how we see and view things. And so in talking about it, the Constitution, the 10th Amendment, there's always an underlying principle that the founders were concerned about. The founding fathers saw abuses of power, and they often wanted to create systems of checks and balances where there's competing interests that won't let one interest get too evil or too far off with what's going on. And as they looked at systems of checks and balances, we certainly have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Those are three we often talk about. But another check and balance was the maintenance of states. And so states had certain roles and responsibilities in the federalist system. And then America was a combination of these states. So the federal government was supposed to be limited in its power and scope. The Constitution established that the federal government had the powers expressly delegated to it by the Constitution, and that it wasn't supposed to have other powers outside that delegation. The 10th Amendment made this clear by stating that the rights not set forth were left to the states, or it says to the people. So it's saying at least we're going to confirm the federal government doesn't have the right to do this if it's not listed in here. But whether it's the states or the people, kind of who knows? We didn't exactly figure that out ourselves as to what rights do states have, what rights do people have. And we weren't given a principle at the time to be able to go through and delineate what might be a personal right, what might be a state right. And that's something we talked about in the last podcast some with the 9th Amendment, where it's very difficult to ascertain what rights, if any, are left. Some people also talk about how states' rights, they claim that term is a misnomer. They say that states weren't given rights by the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment was simply confirming that there were certain things left to the states, but not necessarily saying that there were state rights or that states had rights like people had rights. And so one way to look at it would be to say states' powers, what powers existed to the states. And again, but it's common for people today to refer to that as just states' rights is what they call it. But the 10th Amendment states in full, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So the 10th Amendment is talking about powers, not necessarily rights. So it's saying the powers not delegated to the United States are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And so this one, maybe a better way to say it, just to be fully accurate on what we're talking about, would be states' powers. And what powers do states have? What power does the federal government have? And to what extent, do these two work together? To what extent do they go into conflict with each other? When we look at the history on the court cases involved with, was the power delegated to the state, to the federal government or not? It's difficult to find a clear principle that's come from Supreme Court decisions. They're a little bit, I'd say, all over the place on how they've come down on things. And sometimes they reverse themselves, the Supreme Court has, and decided differently over the years. They decide one way and then they decide differently later. But to give you an idea of some of the things that come up, we currently operate under federal minimum wage requirements. So the federal government says every state has to at least, every employer in every state has to at least pay their employees X amount. Now, one of the big issues with that is what we call the Interstate Commerce Clause in the Constitution expressly gives the federal government the power to regulate interstate commerce. So if a business is selling goods to another business, that creates a system of interstate commerce. And some people who are very, very refined maybe in the way they look at that, they would say, well, maybe the federal government has the power to regulate the product passing from one state to the other, but they can't tell the business that exists solely in one state what to do with their employees, how to pay them, all those things. The Supreme Court's taken a more expansive look and said, interstate commerce clause, that means, yeah, as long as you're doing anything that might be involved in interstate commerce, we can regulate you. And so a business, even now, that doesn't ship anything outside the state. So for example, you could have a plumbing company that exists solely in a state, maybe just in a city. They provide plumbing services. They're still subject to these mandatory federal minimum wage laws. And the question then becomes, well, why? Because according to the 10th Amendment, there has to be a power expressly delegated to the federal government. And ultimately, the Supreme Court's determined that you're impacting interstate commerce. And they've gone so far, they had a case where the federal government capped the amount of wheat that could be produced. They were trying to deal with a number of scenarios in the country back in the 30s and 40s, the 1930s and 1940s. And they capped the amount of wheat that someone could produce. And a man got in trouble who only produced wheat for basically his family and his little farm, but he ran afoul of the cap. And he argued saying, look, according to the 10th Amendment, the federal government can't tell me what to do with my own farm and my own wheat here. And the Supreme Court's reasoning was, actually, the federal government can. This isn't a power left just to the states or to you, because when you produce wheat and then you don't buy wheat because you produced it, you're impacting the price of wheat across the country. And therefore you're impacting interstate commerce, and therefore the federal government can regulate you. Most commentators view that as a pretty expansive interpretation of the Commerce Clause. But with that type of interpretation, as long as the federal government can connect something to money or commerce somewhere, they can argue that it's a power granted under the Interstate Commerce Clause, which means that the 10th Amendment wouldn't apply, if that's true, that power was granted, because the 10th Amendment only says if the power wasn't given to the federal government, then it's reserved to the states. But states maintain the rights with things like minimum wage to set one higher than the federal law. So the federal law provides the minimum. Many states, many cities have gone and passed higher laws and said, well, we're going to make it 15 an hour or whatever else they're coming up with. And so the states and the federal government, there can still be a patchwork of minimum wage laws with the minimum existing at the federal level. But there is a concern with this expansive interpretation of the Commerce Clause, because again, it opens the federal government up to a lot of regulation with the fact that nearly everything's tied to money or a business or something somewhere. But on the flip side, there are still some things that the Supreme Court has recognized are the state's domain. The federal government shouldn't really step in. One of those that's been pretty respected over the years is family law, where divorces, marriage, all those things have been very much defined at the state level for a very long time. Though we saw that break down some with the gay marriage court cases, where the Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional for a state not to provide gay marriage. But outside that scope, I guess there's been a couple cases dealing with things like interracial marriage, where the Supreme Court's also said that it's unconstitutional to ban interracial marriage at the state level. But generally, the rights of states to regulate family law, to regulate property division, to put in place whether they do marital property or community property or other things, that's mostly up to the states. And that's one of the areas that have been left to the states very well over the years. Another one that's interesting is education. Technically, the Supreme Court has held that the federal government was not given the power to regulate education in America, and that that's a state's power. But the Supreme Court, but the federal government also found a way to get around that, in that it allows, or the federal government gives money back to states. So we go back to when the federal government started the income tax. They started taking money from individuals in the states, and then they tell the states, "Oh, we'll give you some back though if you put in these standards, or if you do this, but we won't give it to you if you don't do these things." But it's not regulation. You don't have to. It's up to you. And the Supreme Court upheld that as valid. And so currently we have two areas that have really, I'd say, chipped away at states' rights, or the powers of states, if that's what, if that's the way we should refer to them. We have the expansive interpretation of the Commerce Clause, as well as the power of the federal government to take money from citizens and then give it back. And Michael, just curious if you have any thoughts, concerns with either one of those, or if you see good things about those interpretations, or again, kind of your view on those two issues with respect to states' rights.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we say state rights because when we say, does the state have a power to do something, the question invariably turns to, do they have the right to enforce that? So if the state has power to do X, Y, Z, we say, well, does that right exist? They're almost synonymous at that point. But I think it's those two are the some of the areas we see the most contention in regards to individuals and the federal government. So there's a disconnect between what you see at an individual level and what you see federally is usually when it comes to interstate commerce or education. And they're interesting cases to look at because for most of us, education or our business or even what we purchase is a very local and specific thing to us. And the federal government is such a centralized organization, it's hard to imagine them being able to make good decisions for every individual. And so perhaps one of maybe the downsides to the expansive view on interstate commerce and education is just merely the inability for a centralized resource to reach out and affect individuals locally in a meaningful or maybe in a positive way. It's so difficult to create some piece of legislation that will work for everybody in all their circumstances unless it's very general and based on general principles. But educational needs are very widely, and businesses operations and needs vary widely, and so it's I think there's negative impacts in that respect. Just difficult to legislate at such a specific level. I think the other thing we need to consider in all this is, are any of these powers that should be maintained at the individual level? And maybe we should say, no, not to the federal government, no, not to the state. What do we allow individuals to have power to do? And I think it would be an interesting conversation to have. I think the founders who wrote the Constitution did an amazing job at identifying powers delegated to a federal government. and defining those, whereas there wasn't really anything to guide them in that process. And they came up with the Constitution that really outlined those. And I wonder if we could do a better job as citizens to sit down and say, what might a power be that is delegated to an individual? In a very general sense, I think of something like self-defense. I think we generally agree that the power of self-defense is granted to an individual in a general sense. And we don't say that no one is allowed to their own self-defense. That's a power only delegated to the federal government. I think most people would disagree with that idea. So, starting a conversation like that, what are the powers granted to us? Do they play any role in education? Do they play any role in interstate commerce? Is there some sort of powers granted to us at an individual level that maybe we should be discussing and saying these don't belong at the federal level?
Yeah, and I definitely like your example of self-defense. I like to think about, currently states, to my knowledge, all states have the right to self-defense in their laws. But what if a state said, no, we're not a fan of anyone being killed ever, so you're not justified in using lethal force in self-defense. The question would then become, how can a state do something like that? Can they take away that right from a citizen and say, we'll put you in jail if you kill someone even in self-defense? And that type of question is a fascinating one to look at, to say, ooh, that's really starting to push the boundaries of, can a state even regulate that? And because over the years, there's the case of McRae versus the United States, where basically the Supreme Court said, hey, look, if the states have the power to do it, we're really not going to do anything about it. Yeah, you don't like your taxes in that state. Yeah, you don't like the regulations. Well, too bad. We're not going to overturn them just on the basis that you don't like them. But are there situations where it might become so fundamental and encroach so much on that individual realm and that right to exist and live that even the Supreme Court might say, states, you don't have the power to restrict self-defense. You have to allow self-defense to some measure. Now, there are different rules in states. Some have far more leniency with it than others do. But it's a great example of a states' rights issue that I could actually foresee playing out somewhere. There's a lot of states that like to view themselves as very progressive and against all killing. And who knows if something like that were to come out or to be passed at some point. But it is interesting on this topic to think about, think about one, why do we get so concerned about the federal government making regulation? If the state has the power to do it, why do we even care if it's the state or the federal government that passes it? Because, well, shoot, the state can restrict my life, so the federal government restricted my life. So what? So this has come up with things like the Affordable Care Act, where Massachusetts had passed a law mandating health insurance for all its people. Most people agreed that the state government had the power to compel individuals to purchase something. I personally feel very strongly that no state should have the power to compel an individual to purchase something. We obviously have things like car insurance that are conditioned on, if you want to drive, you have to buy it, but you could choose not to drive if you are very opposed to it and ride a bike or whatever else. And you wouldn't have to buy car insurance. But if there's this obligation to buy health insurance just because you're alive and you can't escape that obligation, I have personal liberty issues with that and constitutional issues with that, to say, can they really compel me to take actions and buy things? Because isn't that a form of slavery at that point? I then have to work, I have to do things to provide for that. And maybe not slavery, that's probably the wrong term, but involuntary servitude, where I now have to work just for the right to exist in that state. I have to pay something. And I have concerns with that type of law. But again, that's an aside. Most people I saw felt states had the power to mandate you purchase health insurance. But then as soon as the federal government mandated that everyone purchase health insurance, there was a big blow up about it. People upset saying that's a states' rights issue or a states' powers issue. Leave that to the states to decide because my state doesn't mandate it. And again, from a theoretical perspective, you can ask the question, does it matter if what branch of government's passing it? If it's if one branch of government has the power, why do we care? What is the principle we're driving at that says federal government shouldn't do it? And I think it goes back to this principle of checks and balances we're talking about. The founders knew there had to be a way to provide some type of redress against the federal government. But they also knew that the states needed the ability to experiment, to do things. And maybe people didn't like it in the states. But I do really believe that the founders envisioned a system where people could leave and a state could fail, or a state could really struggle if its laws became too onerous or too burdensome. And so we do care generally about which government it is passing the laws, because there is this notion still that, well, if everything just becomes uniform across the US and there's no variation in state laws, then states are losing their place. And if they're losing their place in the system, power is centralizing. And as power centralizes, abuses of power become more problematic. But Michael, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on why we care about what level of government is involved with laws that are passed.
I think that's a major one you highlighted, is if the federal government passes all laws, then the question is, what are the states there for? And I know that there are some that don't believe in any kind of state independence or state powers, but I believe that the federated system was created for a purpose, and checks and balances was one of the major ones, in that, like you said, you concentrate power too much in one place, it's too easy to abuse it. There needs to be a check, and the states provide a pretty good check to the federal government, so long as they can maintain some sort of independence. If they have their own powers, and reading the Constitution, it's not like there was a very long list granted to the federal government, which would make you believe that there's a fair amount of power given to the state and to the people. And it would seem that that would be important in maintaining a good balance. I think the second aspect of that is kind of what I mentioned earlier. When you concentrate all lawmaking into a centralized source, but you have a 350 million different people, the ability to legislate over that many people in a centralized area is severely diminished. And you can say, make the government bigger, more people. I think most people understand that the larger it becomes, the harder it is to get anything done. And so there's severe concerns about how do you enact appropriate laws for individuals in areas. Take an area, that doesn't have a large population, of Montana or Wyoming or something. Do they just get completely lost at that point? Federal government doesn't care what happens in Montana or Wyoming, because all the people that they really care about live in the concentrated states, cities in the nation. And so it's concerning to see certain things decided at the federal level, because it feels like there's a removal of that personal relationship with the government. Your ability as an individual to have a say in what happens around you. So those are probably two things that come to my mind.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting looking at, as the government or as the country grows, how diluted our individual voice becomes. And like you say, whether we elect 435 representatives or 1,000 representatives or 10,000 representatives, our voice is still diluted the same just because there's a lot of people in the country. And the states still give us the ability to break that down some. I know here in Utah, I can go meet with my representatives, senators, I can talk to them. That doesn't happen at the federal level. It's very difficult to get an appointment or get in to see reps, to get through to them. You get their office staff maybe responding back. But even then, your one voice feels very different. A senator is going to take that very differently. That represents the state of Utah at the federal level than a senator here in Utah would take that person reaching out to them. And so generally, the more local things stay, the more your voice matters on issues. And the people are still another important check on both sets of governments that exist. And so it is important to keep people in mind that the people need the ability to check things as well. And the more local things are, it's a lot easier to do than it is at the federal level. But on the flip side, it is interesting to look at the scenario of when states need to be checked. And so when we talk about state powers, it's interesting to look at abuses of those powers. So one case, this one fascinates me. 1994, we have a case called Reno versus Condon that comes up. And it is a case arguing over whether the federal government has the ability to pass the Driver's Privacy Protection Act. So prior to 1994, the many states, they said, would mandate that in order to get a driver's license, you provide the state with your photo, your birth information, your name, address, social security number, quite a bit of info. And then they would take it because you want your driver's license, you want to drive, and then they'd sell it to private parties for a lot of money. And these states, a lot of these states were making, according to the Supreme Court, a substantial amount of money off of selling driver's data. And so the federal government looked at that and said, whoa, 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 whoa. We're not a fan of that. You can't sell a driver's information without their consent. And so they passed the Driver's Privacy Protection Act and said, states, you're not allowed to sell that info. And South Carolina, which made quite a bit of money off this, was gutsy enough to sue back and said, no, this is our power. You weren't given the power, federal government, over driving and driver's licenses. This is our domain. Leave us alone. And the district court looked at it and agreed. Said, yep, federal government, you have no right to tell the states what to do. The appellate court looked at it and agreed. Said, yep, federal government, you can't tell the states what to do here. This isn't your power. This isn't your domain. It gets to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yeah, we can tell you what to do here. Federal government can tell you what to do. And they based it in the fact that the federal government wasn't telling the states what they had to do with respect to individuals. So they weren't telling them you have to collect a social security number or you can't collect a social security number. They were telling the states what the states could do for its own commercial activities to make money. And so the federal government was placing regulation on states to say, hey, state, if you're going to be selling information and you maintain a database, we're going to regulate you. Now, that still is problematic in some ways because then it begs the question of, well, what power does that fall under? And again, under an expansive definition of interstate commerce, well, if they're selling it, then the data is crossing state lines, it's going in interstate commerce. And so the federal government can regulate that. And so the Supreme Court allowed that to happen. So generally, again, prior to this, the states were all issuing driver's licenses. We've since seen the federal government come out with a federal ID where they want the real ID or the star on it, whatever they call it. And that's one where the states are sharing the information now with the federal government. And then the federal government didn't come down with a hammer and said, states, you have to do this. because they didn't have the authority necessarily just to tell the states they had to issue a certain type of driver's license, but they said, we're not going to let anyone through the airport anymore. And we control the airports. And so by a certain drop dead date, if you don't have your people to have these driver's licenses, well, they don't get to fly anymore. And that, to me, is, again, another example of, well, are we really respecting states' rights at this point? Because if the federal government can say they're not going to respect a state-issued ID because it didn't give the federal government the data the federal government wanted, and we're going to ban your people from flying, to me, it feels very coercive in nature and very compulsory and very much circumventing, again, what's supposed to be this balance between the states and the federal government. The state should be able to issue an ID, and the federal government have to accept that to say, yep, this is who you are. It's what your state gave you. But for the federal government to come out and say, we're going to keep all your people here, or they have to drive wherever they want to go, but they can't fly. To me, that's a pretty significant loss of liberty. And I don't like that at all. But going back to the Driver's Privacy Protection Act, it's very interesting to say, but these states were mandating that people produce things, and then the states were selling it and making money. And to me, that just reeks of 9th and 10th Amendment issues to say, wait, should any government be in the business of making money? What goes on there? What abuses come so quickly if the state wants to make money? It's been interesting to watch, just for anyone that follows college football remotely at all. The Pac-12 is in its final year, basically fell apart, and virtually everyone agrees it all happened because of money. And there's massive realignments in college football, a lot of things happening, and they say, yeah, the almighty dollar controls. And if the federal government or the state governments have found ways to make money, oh, look at this, people give us all their info, and we can just sell it. Is there not some implied obligation of a fiduciary duty or something to keep this information safe when you have the power to force someone to give it to you? Do you not also have a attendant stewardship over that? And if the states can just make money off of anything, to me, that's very problematic. It becomes very concerning. And it happens, it's another thing that happens even with things like radio licenses. The joke is that, well, the government was actually smart enough to figure out how to make money out of thin air. They sell licenses to radio waves, and they just put them up for auction and let the highest bidder win, essentially. And so they make incredible amounts of money selling licenses for radio waves or TV waves. And again, we don't look at it necessarily and say there's a significant abuse in there, but there is still the government making money off of laws that it passes, regulations it's imposed, licenses it creates, and it's now profiting off of that. Here in Utah, we have a really interesting thing taking place right now where there's still this profit motive. Salt Lake County ends at what they call the point of the mountain on the south end. There's a point where the mountain ranges come in a little bit closer. It kind of narrows to a narrower neck. And a long time ago, the gel was built out there because it was a long ways away from Salt Lake City, and it was just kind of out there. But over the years, development's fully caught up. It's now just looks like one city, essentially from Salt Lake City down into Utah County. And all the development surrounded this big prison site. Well, it was very valuable real estate. It's right next to the freeway. And there's a lot of developers in the Utah government. And so ultimately they voted to move the prison to a new site. They built this crazy expensive prison, moved it to this new location, and then they came up with a development plan for this area. They've tore down the prison. They've got all this land, 600 acres or so. and they're developing it. And it's a, it's a very valuable piece of property, very valuable development. But the Utah government's now going to make money off of this huge development. And some would applaud this, saying, well, that's great. Costs money to build and run a prison, so make money off of it. But it's interesting looking at virtually 95% of the comments on the articles about it. People are crazy opposed because it feels so wrong that there was such a high profit motive dictating what went on in this scenario. And there's such a high profit motive even in dictating what's happening with this land. It was state-owned land, but now it's being used by private developers, others, to build offices and homes and new versions of cities, this 15-minute cities that some people love, some people are concerned about, where everything's within 15-minute walk. And there's more miles of trails in this area than there are miles of roads. Just an interesting note. At least so far in what they've announced with it. Maybe there's more later, I don't know. But still looking at it, people sense that something is very off. Now, is the federal government going to step in? It doesn't sound like it. The federal government's kind of said, hey, the states have the power to do it. They have the power to do it. And the federal government hasn't really stepped in. The courts haven't stepped in when states go off on these profit motives and do things that make them lots of money. But it goes back to a concern that I have strongly of the public-private partnership. When we start to allow the government to become about money, the government to become about making money, involved in the business of money, we are opening ourselves up to a whole new form of regulation. And instead of regulation being about justice or about liberty, it becomes about money and who can make people the richest, and decisions start to be made off of, does it make us money? And so again, I'm not faulting the founders for not spelling all these things out, but to your point, Michael, you had mentioned we need to, as a people, go through and start to articulate what rights do we retain and what is the proper role of government, and can we start to put some additional checks and balances in place to say, hey, government, your business isn't about making money. Don't go making decisions about zoning that bring in the most tax revenue for a city or the most, income for a city necessarily. Make decisions that are based on these principles that are best for the city. Because even a lot of zoning laws come down to that, where here in Utah, we're a desert, they were classified as being a severe drought, or I don't remember the classification. And they're building data centers that consume crazy amounts of water. And we're giving these data centers tax breaks and other incentives to come. And I look at it and go, yeah, this is what happens when it's about money. We're not conserving water for people. We're giving it to Facebook to cool their data with. I could care less about Facebook and its data needs to be cool. Let it go build it in a state where there's a lot of water. But those decisions aren't being made based on what's right. They're being made based on what may bring the state money. And I believe strongly that will lead to a very bad place for us to reach with these things. And so with the money side, again, when the government has the power to take money from us and then give it back with strings attached, there's actually a case that talks about that some, where it was challenged when the federal government started this in the 1930s. They called it tax and credit, where the federal government would take the money from you and then it would give it back with strings attached. And it was challenged as being unconstitutional, saying, hey, this is circumventing the Constitution, you shouldn't allow it. The Supreme Court at the time upheld it. But there was a dissenting justice, Justice Butler, who said, well, this is really bad. And he stated, the provisions in question, if not amounting to coercion in a legal sense. So he's saying we can't legally say it's coercion because people can choose whether they take the money or not. He says they're The provisions in question are manifestly designed and intended directly to affect state action. And if valid is so employed, this tax and credit device may be made effective to enable federal authorities to induce, if not indeed to compel, state enactments for any purpose within the realm of state power, and generally to control state administration of state laws. So he's saying, hey, if this is allowed, they can control any laws that are put into place. And I would extend that out to say, if the states are allowed to have a profit motive to what they're doing, then all of our rights start to become threatened. Our rights, do we have a right to privacy? Some of these individual rights, if the government can make money off of our data and just sell our data, what do we do about that? And our elected officials don't have a strong incentive to do anything about it because it's more money for them to spend and make people happy, more projects they can build, more things they can do. And there's some abuses of power. So to me, the mix of money, government, the mix of private, public, starts to create some serious issues for us.
And to that point, I want to take it a step further. Part of the reason, maybe not the only reason, but a large reason that the state governments, federal government are consistently looking for ways to get more revenue is the cries for them to spend more are just increasing. So we as a people need to look to ourselves and say, what are we asking the government to solve? And if we continue to ask them to solve more and more expensive issues, they will just spend more and more time trying to gain revenue. And so we're asking them in many cases by what we're asking them to legislate to pursue a profit motive. How can we be more profitable? Because, the country wants us to spend X amount on this project or that project. So we should be conscious in what we're asking of our representatives, both at the state and federal level, and say, perhaps we don't ask them to pursue all of these really expensive projects all of the time. Many things we ask the government to do just involves them spending money. We can sometimes think about the government as protecting individual rights, and lots of that comes through legislation. But we ask them to be very active in spending money and building infrastructure and all kinds of things. So we should be conscious of our own requests. The more we request, the more they're going to try to make money, and that's going to insert a profit motive, which, as you've described, kind of leads to really bad outcomes. The other thing I think would be interesting to look at is, like in the example of the states selling individual information, is what does it look like if the Supreme Court said, actually, that's a right maintained by the people. So instead of them coming out with legislation, I'm just kind of taking this off the cuff a little bit. What if the Supreme Court says that the right of an individual's information belongs to the people? And so if a state wants to take it and ask what an individual is willing to do with their information, then they can sell it. Otherwise, they can't. And I'm not saying that's the ultimate result here, but I wonder what it looks like for the Supreme Court to say, actually, this is a right retained by the people. It's not retained by the federal government or by the states. It's given a right or a power given to the people. The person has ultimate power over their information, and it has to be treated as such. You obviously have more experience on the legal side, so I'm not sure repercussions there. But in general, I wonder what it looks like for the Supreme Court if they would ever say, actually, this is something reserved to the people and to neither federal nor state governments.
Yeah, it's a real interesting question, because it's another. There's a couple of fascinating levels to that question from a legal perspective, but at the outset, I'd say, in general, it'd be, the Fourth Amendment says the right of the people to be secure in their houses, papers, effects, and things shall not be infringed. They want this probable cause for the government to go and investigate. And so it is interesting to say that the government, can they condition the granting of privileges, like what they call driving a privilege? Can they condition the granting of this driving privilege on the production of something that is protected. So even if the Supreme Court said, hey, this is protected, these are the people's, well, the states would just have to say, well, you don't have to have a driver's license then, fine. But if you want to give it to us, you got to waive that. And it's where I go into this question sometimes of, well, can you waive constitutional rights? Can the government condition the granting of something on the waiver of a constitutional right? Because it's interesting, even if I want to join a court hearing that's online, which many court hearings are now, I generally have to have WebEx. WebEx is a private company. That private company has the right to say, Austin, you waive your right to a jury trial if you have a dispute with me. And I have to accept their terms and conditions in order to get on the court system. And so then the courts are saying the only way you can access this is through WebEx. And so you have to agree to these things, but you could be forced to waive constitutional rights in that scenario. Now, I'm not saying what WebEx's terms and conditions are or aren't. I haven't looked at them. But for the courts here in Utah that use WebEx, it still begs the question of, well, now I'm being forced to waive a right in order to participate in something that I'm privileged to do if they require mandatory arbitration. And so there's this notion of, currently the courts have allowed there to be some level of waiver of rights associated with things where you can say, well, if you want to participate, you got to waive your rights. So even if there was found to be a right to your own data, they may still say, what, you voluntarily choose to give it up when you surrender it for the driver's license. And that's why I go more to saying, what if, instead of saying there's so much a personal right to your data from a legal perspective, to look at it more as to say, elected officials, government becomes a fiduciary of information it requires of you. And as a fiduciary, you can't just give that out and harm people, because you are here for the people. And so you can't just sell their info to someone. You're a fiduciary over it. So sure, you can ask for it, state, but if you ask for it, you can be held liable for misuse of that information. And then the states would have this check in place to say, ooh, do we really want to take this info? Because if we can be held liable for mandating it, then let's only take the info we absolutely need, because I don't want to be liable for the other info. And so, and even if you look at something like Social Security, Social Security is taken from us under the pretense that the government holds it, invests it, and gives it back to us. But we're supposedly getting back our money we paid in. From my perspective, if that's the case, the government's holding it as a trustee. It's been entrusted to their care. They need to now make good use of it. And if those elected officials are now going to rob my money and take it out and say, I'll replace it later, I go, hey, what if anyone that voted for that could be held personally liable to say, oh, you breached your fiduciary duty here? When you mandate that money comes from me, if you have the power to do that and you're holding it for me in my behalf, then hold it for me in my behalf. Don't go spend it. You can't go spend it, because that's a breach of fiduciary duty. And I'm very interested in an approach to individual rights through the fiduciary realm, where if the government's taking something from us, they're mandating it and they're holding it for us, well, that's as a fiduciary. So sure, pick what you take from me to condition all these privileges on. If I want to work, I got to pay Social Security, but choose carefully, because I can hold you personally liable, elected official, for misuse of that. And I think that would radically change a lot of our government and make them way more cautious about any misuse of stuff they take from us, and make them even ask the question, do I even want it? I don't want to be liable for that, so I won't even take it from them. Do I have to have it? So that's one way I like to look at it. But the second level with that, if I can remember here, we were talking about
if the federal government, the Supreme Court said this isn't a right retained by the federal government or the state, but it's retained by the people.
Yeah, what that would look like.
Yeah. Because it sounds funny, because the Supreme Court is essentially saying the federal government will enforce this.
Yeah.
Which almost makes it sound like a federal right or power. So it's a funny situation. How do the people have the right to it if they can't enforce it? I guess maybe is the better question.
Yeah, and again, it is a fascinating question where, again, the courts have kind of said, yeah, we don't have the power to enforce personal rights because there was no guiding principle given to us as to what that looked like. And it is, to your point, this funny conundrum of, well, who can enforce it in the end? Because let's even say the Supreme Court says, hey, executive branch, you can't do that, but the executive branch does it. Well, then it's up to us as people to enforce it. What does that start to look like? And now some people would say, oh, we absolutely have the right, citizens arrest, we'll arrest people, we'll storm offices, we'll use our guns, whatever. But it gets to be really messy at that point because there's no orderly way for the people to keep their rights other than to say, well, could we have a recall election at that point? Could we kick them out? But what if the majority of the people are okay with it, even though it is a personal right? What does that start to look like? It becomes very interesting and very problematic for sure. It's too bad the second point slipped in my mind at the moment of when we talk about these it's slipping my mind. So we'll move on. A couple points to note about states' rights are that there are still struggles between the state and federal government. So, for example, we see marijuana. Federal government outlaws marijuana, and states start to say, you know what? We're not going to enforce those federal laws anymore. We don't have to. You can't make us. There was a case called Prince versus United States where the Supreme Court said, yeah, you can't force state police to enforce certain laws. You can't tell the police what they have to do. Now, could the government fund the police, give them a lot of extra money, and then say you only get it if you do X, Y, and Z? Yeah. But you can't just outright tell them what they have to do. And so the drug enforcement relied on the states to voluntarily enforce it. And it was state police enforcing these federal laws, but states started to say, we're not going to do anything about it. Federal government, you don't have a strong police force, so too bad, we're going to have marijuana in our state. And so far, the federal government hasn't really done much about it. They've let each state start to make that decision. Still a little with some trepidation because at any point the federal government could smack down on it. But we have things taking place with immigration where some states will say, hey, you're an illegal immigrant. The federal government wants to deport you. Guess what? We'll give you a sanctuary in the city. Come on in here. We'll let you stay. And they're fighting with the federal government over the laws and saying, your agents aren't welcome here. We don't want you here. We're not going to enforce it. Now, states are starting to do that with gun control laws too. They're starting to say, well, we'll become a gun control sanctuary. We're not going to enforce any gun control mechanisms. And there was even a bill proposed in Utah last legislative session that said that the proposal was that state officials weren't allowed to enforce any federal gun regulations. And the federal government had to do it all if they wanted to. And so states and the federal government kind of will tussle over these things, fight over them. But one really interesting one that's come up that goes back to this privacy issue we talked about a little bit is the federal government's passed a new law called the Corporate Transparency Act. It goes into effect January 1st, 2024. And it requires that small business owners, so of 5 million or less in revenue or 22 employees or less, have to file disclosure statements to provide information to FinCEN, which is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. So it's kind of like a criminal bureau of the federal government that looks into money laundering and other things. Who owns every business and who the ownership is at any level of 10% or more in a business. And there's pretty heavy fines associated with not complying. If you move, you're supposed to update your address with FinCEN so they know exactly where you are all the time as a business owner. And if you don't, if you have 30 days after you move to do it, if you forget to do it, you can be fined up to $500 per day for not updating. And that's pretty steep. And it very much feels like they're treating all small business owners as criminals. You have to send in your driver's license or your passport to prove who you are, register with FinCEN, get all approved. And I look at it and go, this is a little wild, because traditionally business registration's been a state's power for many years. States control the creation of a business entity. You can create a Utah business entity or a Nevada business entity or an Indiana business entity, but you don't create a federal business entity or a U.S. business entity. The federal government doesn't issue the creation of companies to private parties. And so now the federal government's coming and stepping into that, saying, well, we want your data. We want your people. We want to be able to track every owner, know exactly where they live, know exactly who they are. And that's something that we're interested in. And that is, to me, a battle waiting to happen between, well, is this our domain as states? Federal government, can you come in and require all this info? These people haven't done anything wrong. They may not even have any interstate commerce. They may just hold vacant real estate sitting in the state, and that's it. And what happens then? And so it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out. But again, from a federal government, state government perspective, do we want the federal government to now be tracking all this information and sharing it with who knows who? They don't have restrictions on who they can sell it to or share it with. The states can't tell the federal government who they can sell it to or share it with. And so there's not a check and balance on those types of things. There's not a fiduciary duty imposed. And to me, it creates a funny scenario in America, one of concern, as we watch the federal government continue to expand its reach, to say, business is done really well in America, allowing the 50 states to have their say in business entities, how they're structured, what goes on. And now the federal government's saying, no, for all the small ones. We'll let the big ones do whatever they want still. But anyone that's small, no. And to me, it, again, feels problematic. Why does the state want to document us? The government want to document us. What are these things going on? But mostly, I really feel it runs afoul of the spirit and intent of the Constitution. Federal government wasn't given powers to force us to identify all ownership in a business. The states dealt with that. The states have dealt with that just fine for many years. And the federal government's now collecting information and power. So, but ultimately, I think, Michael, like you say, one of the biggest things about these issues is what we're asking our elected leaders to do. Because we're asking them to solve problems. We're asking them to lower taxes. We're asking them to spend more money. We want nicer facilities. We want more money to education. We want all these things. And that does force them into scenarios where they have to get creative. I've even seen proposals, and I don't know if I'm necessarily against it or for it, but it's one of interest to me, academic interest at least. But one of the proposals for the governments to make a lot of money is to sell the naming rights to roads and bridges and government buildings. And so you could have, here in Utah, we have the Delta Center, named after Delta Airlines, but you could have the Delta Sky Bridge or the Delta Airport instead of the Salt Lake City Airport. You could have Apple Way, named after Apple, because they bid and paid X amount of money for 5 years of street naming rights. And then again, the question is that where we want to go? Is that how desperate we want to be to raise money? But to your point, if we ask the government to solve so many things, if we ask the government to give money back to us, we're asking them to pull money out of somewhere. And things start to get more and more concerning as money becomes the controlling force. Because government's not supposed to be about money. Government's supposed to be about liberty. maintaining this appropriate balance. And we as a people have to remember that the government should not be our savior or our solution to all our problems. We have to be that as well. So Mike, I don't know if you have anything else for today with the 10th Amendment.
No, I think that was a good way to end it. That ultimately, what are we asking? What are the questions we're asking? What are we expecting of our government? And many of these issues arise because I don't know that we fully define. I don't know that we know what we expect of our government sometimes. Sometimes we look to them as a savior. Sometimes we look to them as they're in the way all the time. And I think you've got to decide, what it should be, and then live with kind of the consequences of that. If they're going to be the savior, they're going to be getting in the way all the time. That's the way it goes. And so we have to consciously make that decision. What are we asking them to be? And then let's live with the consequences of that.
Yeah. And certainly we have to live with the consequences, but ultimately I think both of us would encourage people to say, really take some stock to say, there are problems we can solve. We don't have to ask our government to do everything. Let's get back to this balanced place.
Right. And I guess my point there was to say, if we ask them to not be the savior all the time, the consequence of that is we need to take some responsibility as citizens, which is what I would recommend. We need to stand up a little straighter, taller, and maybe not spend so much time in leisure, and maybe spend more time in our community and see if we can solve some issues that we don't need the government to step in and solve.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to say. That is the consequence. And it's, in our opinion, a good consequence that we have more responsibility if we ask the government not to do things. So think about that. Think about what your liberty means to you. Think about what your country means to you. And what type of world you're willing to live in. One where you take responsibility for your life and the world around you, or one where you just ask someone else to figure it out. Because if you're willing just to ask someone else to figure it out, you're subject to whatever power comes in and whatever solution they propose. And to us, that's not a great way to be. So thanks for joining us as we talked about the 10th Amendment. And we look forward to meeting with you again next week. Thanks so much.